Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of For the Record with Tess Heard. I'm Tess Heard, and this is For the Record. I hope that you all are having an incredible week and an even more incredible Friday, or whatever day it is that you're listening to this on. Maybe you like your true crime on a Wednesday evening, soaking in the tub, surrounded by candles with lavender-scented bath salts. Or maybe you prefer your true crime on a random Tuesday afternoon while walking the dog or carrying out the trash. Either way, I'm just glad you're here, and thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Today, we are continuing the case of Roch Theriault and the cult he would come to lead. I think I got a little mixed up last week on when Roch actually left the Seventh-day Adventist Church, so I am going to clarify that in this episode. But we left off with Roch having an, quote, encounter with God while on a retreat in the wilderness with the Seventh-day Adventist Church. He claimed that while he was sitting on this cutout on a cliff, he saw the white light of God, and God told him that the land he stood on was holy. I said it sounded like the story of Moses from the Bible and the burning bush, but I didn't quite realize how true that statement would be. So without further ado, this is the rest of the story of Roch Theriault and the Anthill Kids. After this encounter with God on this holy land, Roch decided it was time to take things a step further. He, along with his 8 live-in followers, Giselle, Solange, Chantel, Francine, Nicole, Gabrielle, Jackie, and Claude, they had begun to grow a reputation as healer. Specifically, Roch was the healer, and his followers were just his assistants, I guess. In lieu of this, Roch decided that it was time to leave Thetford Mines and relocate to Ste. Marie, which, according to Murderpedia, was 65 kilometers south of Quebec City. Like I said in last week's episode, I don't know Canadian geography, so I have no idea where this is at. In Ste. Marie, Roch and his followers would open up the Healthy Living Clinic, a, quote, clinic that focused on the Seventh-day Adventist diet and clean eating, as well as sell church literature. This is where Roch would slowly find more followers, with several of them selling all of their personal belongings, donating all of the profits to the clinic before joining Roch in his cult. Geraldine Auclair would be admitted to the Healthy Living Clinic in March of 1978. She had been diagnosed with leukemia and was receiving treatment from a hospital in Quebec City, but somehow Geraldine's husband had met Roch, and it all went downhill from there. Mr. Auclair was convinced by Roch to admit Geraldine to the clinic instead of having received treatments from the hospital. You know, the well-educated, scientifically proven ways and medications where they treat people with illnesses. Apparently, that just wasn't the right way to go. Roch actually went to the hospital to visit Geraldine, where he got into a very loud verbal altercation with her doctors about treatment and the amount of drugs they were giving her. Up until this point, Geraldine's health had been improving, so the drugs must have been working, at least to some degree. But still, Roch insisted that Geraldine be brought to the clinic where he could heal her from her leukemia. Now, Roch's idea of treating leukemia was a regimen of grape juice. Yes, you heard that right. Grape juice and organic foods. Don't get me wrong. I believe that a healthy diet can greatly improve your overall health. But I am also a huge advocate for medications and treatments. You know, I live with a chronic illness day in and day out. And I listen to my doctors, I take the medication they prescribe, and I'm still kicking. So they must be onto something. And even as a Christian, I believe that God gave man the knowledge to make medicine. So I don't think that all medicine is bad. Anyways, Geraldine was drinking her grape juice and eating her organic diet, but her health was not improving. And after an unknown amount of time spent in the clinic, Geraldine tragically died at the hands of Roch. He told his followers that she had died, and when he had gone into her room, he kissed her and she awoke again, but then she died again. He said in a quote from Murderpedia, "You know, when God wants people, he takes them. It was Geraldine's time." Around this same time, there was also another female, a young 19-year-old girl with severe multiple sclerosis. She was admitted to the clinic. Her parents had met Roch at one of his anti-smoking seminars and thought he would be able to help their daughter. Little else is said about this girl other than later on he married her, but did not have any kind of intimate relations with her as she could not physically do so. On top of these failed attempts to heal people and having more and more people blindly following Roch into the cultish ways he was establishing, he also made the workers at the clinic wear very cult-like uniforms. The women were to wear green ankle-length tunics, while the men were to wear beige tunics of the same cut. Roch, of course, wouldn't have to wear this. No, he wore a brown robe. Just a robe. I don't know if this was like a house coat or a plush robe, but it was a robe. The patrons of the clinic would volunteer their resources and their time to the clinic. Like I said before, several of these people sold everything they owned and donated the money to the clinic and to Roch, and then joined this little commune thing that he had going on. With more and more people joining the cult, all of the women, except for one very smart lady, Maurice Grenier, began to fight for Roch's affection. They all wanted to be the apple of his eye, the one woman he adored more than any other. Now, Giselle, who Roch had been involved with since before his marriage to Francine ended, you know, the one that he moved in with but didn't actually move in with because it was wrong for a man and woman to live together before they were married, but he was still sleeping with her. Yeah, that one. She was noticing all of these women vying for Roch's attention and affection. And she was really becoming worried that she was going to lose him to one of the other girls. So she proposed to Roch in hopes that marriage might keep him by her side and in her bed only. Roch took about a week to finally give Giselle an answer, and they were married on January 28, 1978, at an Adventist church in Montreal. The whole group attended, and the entire 5-hour trip back to Ste. Marie, Giselle laid on a mattress in the back of the van and wept as Roch joked around and flirted with all the other women in the group. Giselle was convinced that her marriage was not done out of love, but out of an act to prove Roch was sincere to the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Unfortunately for Roch, the Seventh-day Adventists were not convinced, and one of their members, Pierre Zita, had even tried approaching parents of some of the girls in the cult to attempt to have them bring their girls home. He even tried to convince Giselle herself, Roch's new wife, to leave him and the cult. The hold that Roch had on these women, though, was untouchable. Some of the parents of the girls had asked police to please go and get their daughters, or at least try to talk them into coming home. But when police came, the girls just flat out refused to speak to them. After the death of Geraldine in the clinic, the Seventh-day Adventists finally decided to vote Roch out of the church. At Pierre Zita's request, in April of 1978, he was pretty much disowned from the church. Roch was less than happy about this and decided to take his anger out on his followers. Now, he didn't necessarily do anything bad at this point, but he decided that to have more control over them, he was going to marry them off to other members of the group. Despite the men and the women not being remotely interested in one another, Roch paired up several men and women, Claude Ouellette with Solange Boillard, Jackie Fiest with Nicole Roule, and several others who were not mentioned. Solange decided to invite her parents to the wedding, and after consulting their own priest, they decided to attend just to be there for Solange and show her that they were still on her side and that they still loved her, despite their worries and concerns about her being in this cult. Many of her family members wept bitterly at the ceremony. Roch stressed the meaning of what it meant to be a wife and how the woman was essentially a servant to her husband. Solange's family was even more concerned for her after this. Later that spring, Giselle would find herself pregnant with Roch's child. She was still having difficulty with the attention he was giving the other women, so she gave him an ultimatum: break the commune and send the other girls off, or she was going back home to her father. Roch's response to this? Punch her in the face and forbid her to leave the room for the next 2 days. The downward spiral that begins now is one that I can only tell you to prepare yourselves for. What we've talked about so far has been child's play compared to what is about to come. If you are sensitive, squeamish, or easily upset by graphic things, stop right now and do not finish this episode. I am trying to give you a fair warning, so please stop. Do not continue if you are sensitive or do not like graphic things. Please don't say that I didn't warn you if you continue to listen. You are listening on your own accord. Okay? Let's move on. June of 1978, the demise of the Healthy Living Clinic was inevitable. With the Seventh-day Adventist Church cutting off their organic foods and literature supplies, the clinic was not bringing in as many patients. Despite still making decent money, though, the clinic was also accumulating an increasing amount of debt that was not being paid. Police were also keeping an eye on the clinic, which had increased significantly since Geraldine's death earlier in the year. With the lack of supplies and the increase in police surveillance, Roch decided it was time to up and move. After several weeks of traveling, the group found themselves in the village of St. George, and on July 9th, 1978, the group began hiking for 2 days until they came across an isolated plot of land near a body of water called Le Sec, or translated to Dry Lake. Roch named this mound of land Eternal Mountain, where the group would experience the end of the world on February 17th, 1979. This would be the place where they would become the, quote, chosen people who would survive boulder-sized hail, lightning, and earthquakes. They would all survive if and only if they lived a righteous life. Without a second thought, the group agreed and they began to make this area of land their new home. They all set up tents for the time being, but quickly got to work on what would be the community cabin, where a well would be placed in the center for water, beds would be available for each family, and concerts and shows would be put on by Roch when he was feeling up to performing. Which, I mean, his whole life has been a huge performance at this point, so. The group would work at least 17 hours a day, 7 days a week, cleaning the land and moving supplies and just getting the place up in order. Claude and Jackie were tasked with shoveling the ground until they found water. When they did, Roch exclaimed that it was a miracle. On top of their slave-like workdays, Roch also rationed their food, and if anyone complained or griped about still being hungry, he would cut off their portions even more so than he already had. Roch himself could eat as much as he wanted, though. He also did not have to do any of the manual labor that the followers were doing. He claimed his stomach pains from his ulcers were too much for him to be doing manual labor, and that his role as their leading priest, or whatever, was much more important than their manual work. Several of the followers left after this, saying their passports had expired and they had to return home. Others just left, and when that happened, Roch told the group that the devil had devoured them and they were evil in God's eyes now. The cabin was complete in September of 1979. It consisted of one room with a floor made of pounded wood rounds, a well in the center, a ceiling made of logs covered in moss and twigs, and rooms made of meter-high partitions that were separated by bed sheets hung from the ceiling. As if this wasn't bad enough, Roch also wanted to give everybody new names from the Old Testament. He was Moses. I wonder why he chose Moses. Something to do with the holy ground and the burning bush? Now, his followers affectionately would call him Pappy, and his wife, Giselle, would be Mammy. In October of that year, Giselle went to Roch and told him that the women who were not married off previously were lonely. Roch then decided it would be a grand idea to marry all of the women in the cult and annul any of the previous marriages he'd arranged. Now, Giselle found out around this time that Roch had slept with Nicole Rule while everyone else was still working on the cabin. Giselle, understandably being hurt and upset, ran from the commune, only to be dragged back by Roch, where he then wrapped his hands around her throat and choked her until she almost passed out. After this, Giselle was too terrified to try and leave again. Shortly after this, Roch gave up the Seventh-day Adventist diet and began eating junk food and meat and dairy, and he also began drinking again. At first, it was only communion wine, then beer, and then the harder liquors. He even went so far as to prostitute some of the women out to local grocers so they could get the things he wanted, like meat and cheese and milk. At one point, Maurice Grenier was pregnant and needing more sustenance, and so she ate 2 more pancakes at breakfast than Roch himself ate. He punched her in the side, breaking 2 of her ribs as a punishment. When Maurice started to talk about leaving, Roch told her husband to cut off one of her toes. When her husband gasped in horror, Roch asked him, and this is a quote, he said, "What, are you a faggot? Don't you have any balls? If you want to be a man, you have to learn how to teach your woman a lesson. Maurice's husband began to cry, and so Roch picked up an axe and said he would go and cut off all of her toes himself. Instead of letting that happen, her husband took the axe and cut off one of Maurice's pinky toes. He then became Roch's enforcer. But nothing else is said about that throughout the rest of my research, so I really don't know what that means. We're going to fast forward a little bit here. In the early part of 1980, Roch's two sons from his first marriage, Roch Jr. and Francois, were coming to the commune to live with him. Roch decided to throw a huge party to celebrate. Guy Vier, the newest member of the cult, was not invited to the party, but was put on babysitting duty for the children. According to Roch, Vier had lost his temper with 2-year-old Samuel and punched him in the face 5 or 6 times. According to Giselle, Samuel only had some slight bruising on his head, still bad, but he was okay. But Roch decided the child needed to be circumcised. He used a 94% ethanol solution to not only sterilize the razor, but also filled a bottle and gave it to baby Samuel to, quote, sedate him for the procedure. The alcohol alone was enough to kill Samuel, but the actual cause of his death is unknown. They burned Samuel's body, and after that, everything went back to normal. 6 months later, drunk and angry, Roch thought it was the perfect time that Guy Vier should be held responsible for the death of Samuel. They had a trial of sorts, and 7 out of 10 people wanted to castrate Vier. Vier suffered from headaches, and Roch told him that if they castrated him, his headaches would go away. So Vier agreed. Shockingly, the procedure was painless for Vier, and after he healed, he never once complained of another headache. Now, I wonder if he never complained of another headache because he didn't have any, or because he knew that if he said anything about having another headache, Roch would, maybe want to take off the whole member and not just, castrate him. But the audacity of Roch to say that removing his testicles would cure his headache is it's unreal to me. This would not be the end of the torment that Vier would face, though. Roch essentially made him the pincushion of the cult. He would beat Vier, play mind games with him, and have other members stab him in the chest with knives in hopes that he would eventually bleed out, but then call it off, like God calling Abraham off right before he sacrificed Isaac. Vier had finally had enough, and one night he escaped to a local village where he told police that a child had been killed by being kicked by a horse. Police went to the commune, but when questioned about the child who died and Vier's medical situation, they all told police that Vier had killed the child, and they voted, showing the ballots for his castration, and the letter of consent which Roch had asked him to sign after telling him his castration would cure his headaches. The police found the remains of Samuel and promptly removed the other 7 children from the commune, placing them in foster homes. A coroner was able to determine that the group was at fault for Samuel's death, and Roch, Maurice, Jackie, Gabrielle, and Guy Vier were all charged with criminal neglect causing bodily harm to Samuel. Claude, the one who burned the body, was charged with obstruction of justice. Jackie and Maurice were charged with neglect towards their oldest daughter, and Claude and Solange were also charged with neglect towards their son. Roch and Gabrielle were also charged with bodily harm with intent to mutilate Vier. They all pleaded not guilty. The sentencing for the group was minuscule to what it should have been. Roch, 2 years. Gabrielle, 9 months with 3 years probation. Veer was sentenced, but he would be acquitted on reason of mental instability and would be transferred back to the hospital Robert Gifford. I'm not sure the pronunciation on that. The rest of the group was let out on bail on the condition that they would not return to the cabin. They all received probation, with Claude also having to serve 6 months in prison. The cult would spread themselves out across Quebec City in apartments so to be closer to Roch while he served his time. In February of 1984, Roch was released from prison, and while the rest of the members wanted to stay in the city, Roch had other plans. They went back into the wilderness to start all over, from the very beginning, like they had done several years before. They rebuilt their home, this time with a full kitchen and a bakery. They had a way to mill in water from the spring that was on a neighboring lot, and had a smokehouse. They also had a stone, quote, sanctuary, well, where Roch would go and, quote, commune with God. This entire place was built by 9 women and 2 men. 9 women. Girl power, am I right? 4 of these women were also pregnant, and they were looking after the 10 children they'd had in the commune. Now, I don't know if 7 of these children were the 7 that had been removed from the home previously, or if somehow in between the time that Roch was in prison, they had 10 children. I really don't know. I don't think so, because the children ranged from ages 2 to 15, I believe. So some of those kids must have been the ones that had previously been taken from the commune whenever they found out about baby Samuel. They would work all throughout the summer, and they wore long sleeves and pants even during the hottest days to keep the bugs from getting them. This time, Roch designated each of his wives a certain chore or responsibility. There was no indication of what those were, other than it said that Maurice was the lowest on the totem pole. When the government wouldn't give the commune financial assistance because they were considered an institution and not a family, the group began to steal. One of the members was caught stealing along with 5 others, and what was the grand prize for stealing? Being banned from ever shopping in the town ever again. Great idea, guys. That's the way to show them. After this, though, Roch began asking his followers to reach out to their families for money. When the parents told the girls they could have money, but only if they left the commune, Roch would then say that this only proved his point even more, that the outside world was evil and trying to get them. Because of not having any money, the group decided to start selling their fruits and pastries from the commune. This gave them an income. This is also where Roch gave them the name the Anthill Kids, because they looked like a swarm of ants working together. Roch began to become increasingly bored, though, and when Roch was bored, Roch would drink. When Roch would drink, Roch would become a completely different person. He would rant and rave about his precious treasures, which really were just costume jewelry pieces that weren't worth a dime. He would beat the members of the commune and have them perform heinous sexual acts to one another. He would beat them with the blunt side of an axe or a hammer, not allowing them to go to the hospital afterwards. He would have the members urinate on each other or rub feces on each other. He even went so far as to slice Jackie's jugular with a broken glass, then ordered him to be circumcised. Yet the members of the cult still followed him with no questions. You see, in their eyes, they had sinned, and Roch was purifying them of their sins by punishing them the way he did. After all of these acts, though, and when the alcohol had worn off, Roch would cry and beg God to stop using him as a means to act out his cruel justice. And let me tell you right now, God's cruel justice is not like this. In fact, God doesn't have cruel justice, okay? God is just and he does have justice, but this is not in the means of physical torment at the hands of another human being. That is not God. That is a wicked, twisted human being using God's name to invoke control and power. That is a cult. That is a cult leader. Now, we're getting to some of the worst in this case. Gabrielle had become pregnant with Roch's baby, a boy who they would name Eleazar. I think that's how you pronounce that. Eleazar. Roch hated this child, often beating him and claiming he bore the mark of the beast. As an act of quote-unquote mercy, on the morning of January 26, 1985, Gabrielle put her 5-month-old son in a wheelbarrow outside in the 14-degree cold around 9 a.m. By 10:45 a.m., Eleazar would be dead, frozen to death at the hands of his own mother. Al Lackey, the county coroner and a friend of Roch, claimed that the child died from sudden infant death syndrome. After this, the commune would be watched like a lion hunting its prey. Things only began to get worse. One night, Claude had upset Roch for no known reason, and as punishment, made him wear a tightly wound rubber band around his scrotum. He had to wear it overnight, causing irreparable damage. Roch then, quote, operated on Claude, removing his testicles, plucking them out with nothing but his fingers. Now, I am obviously not a man, but that even made me squirm. Roch then threatened to kill Claude, who was somehow able to get up and run away, hiding in the woods until the next day when Roch would have had time to calm down and sober up. Then, just a short time later, he got angry with Giselle and threw a beer bottle at her, causing a 3-inch deep gash to her leg. Roch drank another beer and then went to sleep, waking up the next day to Giselle's leg infected with a blood clot. Roch would then press on her leg until the wound reopened and then used a hot iron to cauterize the wound. When it was still infected a few days later, he opened it back up again and filled it with salt, ouch, olive oil, gross, and spruce gum. Giselle tried to escape when her leg had improved some, but Roch would always find her and beg her to come back, saying that it was her role in God's plan to be his wife. See, using God as a means of power and control. That's a cult, people. His tyrant and role of abuse only went on. He would take hot irons dipped in acetone and rub it over his followers' skin until their skin would bubble. He punched his son, Roch Jr., in the face when he refused to wrestle with his little brother, Francois. He beat 3-month pregnant Nicole, causing her to have a miscarriage. He later shot Nicole with a .303 caliber bullet through her shoulder. He broke Giselle's nose with his steel-toed boots. He pulled 11 of Claude's teeth with a pair of pliers. He tied Claude up and suspended him from the ceiling, demanding the women pluck all of his body hair out with tweezers one by one. And his abuse didn't end with the people. No, he even beat one of the commune's horses to death with a chain, and then had Claude burn the body. He would make his followers eat each other's feces and dead mice. He shot them, he choked them until they passed out, he whipped them in the face, causing damage to their eyes. He stuck a needle in Gabrielle's back and twisted it until it broke off under her skin. He burned her breast and her genitals with a torch. He had Jackie cut off half of her left pinky finger with a pair of wire cutters. At one point, Gabrielle's uterus had prolapsed, meaning it was literally falling out of her body. Her uterus was protruding 3 inches out of her lady bits. Roch thought that punching her uterus back inside her body would fix it. He then made a wooden cone and truss to, quote, plug her up so it wouldn't fall out again. When that didn't work, he tied a string around the exposed part of her uterus and tried to rip it out like a loose tooth. Gabrielle would eventually have to have a partial hysterectomy because of the damage done, but it would be over a year later before that would happen. Solange would be his next victim. Solange had begun to feel ill, and Roch said it was her liver and she needed an operation. He took her to the bakery where she stripped down and laid on the table. He forcefully inserted an enema made of molasses, oil, and water. Half an hour later, nothing had happened, so he began punching and pushing on her stomach. When Solange tried to cover herself up with her hands and defend herself, protect herself, Roch simply told her to move her hands, and she did. Then, Roch shoved a tube down her throat and had other women blow and suck on the tube. Then, he cut a 5-inch incision on her right side below her ribs and pulled out a piece of body tissue 4 inches long and 1/4 of an inch thick. He told her she would be fine now and had another one of the members sew her up. Afterwards, he gave her a warm bath filled with cherries, weird, which only made her feel worse. He then had her sit in a cold bath before going to bed, blood now coming out of her mouth. Solange would go to sleep that night, never to wake up. Doctors would later say that Solange had died of acute peritonitis, an inflammation of the peritoneum caused by digestive fluids leaking into the abdominal cavity. After Solange's death, Roch tried ending his own life several times, but was unsuccessful, saying that a force always stopped him, that God didn't want him to die. And I don't think that God wants anyone to die, even the most heinous of people, but I don't think that very many people would have been upset if he would have succeeded. This is where I think I fought with whether or not I wanted to keep listening to true crime. After a while, Roch had someone officiate a wedding between himself and Solange's corpse. After this, he had her body dug up from the ground and had Gabrielle cut her open and pour vinegar into her body over her vital organs to keep the worms away. She was buried again, only to be exhumed again 3 days later, when he had Jackie drill a hole into her skull. Roch then grotesquely and disgustingly masturbated into Solange's skull, allowing his seed to spill on her half-rotten brain, believing that this would bring her back to life. Giselle could see that this was absolutely deplorable and told Roch that Solange had wished to be cremated. Roch agreed, but before burning her body, he had Gabrielle remove one of her ribs so he could always have a piece of her with him. After burning the body, Roch took some of the bone fragments left and put them in a jar with olive oil to preserve them. Roch would then continually masturbate into the jar in hopes of giving her sort of a reverse birth by bringing her back to life with his sperm. Thankfully, we are finally coming to an end with this horror show. Sometime later, Gabrielle would tell Roch that she had a stiff pinky finger. Without saying a word, Roch stabbed her entire hand with a kitchen knife, pinning her to the table. Gabrielle did not cry. She did not scream. She did not react in any way. Roch then went and got another beer, waited about 45 minutes, came back, and her entire hand had turned blue. And Roch said the only way to save it was to cut the arm off. He took a carpenter knife and began whittling away at her bone and chipping away at the nerves, but then he got tired and told one of the other girls to finish the job. She was carefully trying to finish the job, but she couldn't get through the bone. So Roch pulled out the knife from her hand and took her over to a stump that was in the floor and took a meat cleaver and smashed her arm, missing the bone the first time. The second time he got it, amputating Gabrielle's arm. The next day, Gabrielle fled to a woman's shelter, but she returned shortly after at the request of Jackie. When she returned, Roch said that her arm looked infected and used a pair of scissors to cut out the infection. He also sliced her head open and took out a large chunk of one of her breasts. Gabrielle fled again into the woods, but soon found that bugs had laid eggs in her head wound, and she returned to the cabin once more. Roch was still drunk when she returned and still wanting to operate. After sawing off the gear shaft of one of the vehicles, Roch heated up the metal until it was burning red. He then pressed the scorching metal against Gabrielle's arm, but he was so drunk that he kept dropping it and hitting her body elsewhere. When he finally finished, Gabrielle ran and she never looked back. August 16th, 1989, Gabrielle found her way to a hospital. She tried to come up with some story about what happened to her arm, but when police arrived, they ended up filing a charge of aggravated assault against Roch. When police arrived at the compound on the 19th of August, the plot of land had all but been abandoned. It would take police 6 weeks to find Roch and the rest of the cult. After being found, he was sent before the court and sentenced to 12 years in prison for the assault of Gabrielle. Giselle came forward that same day and told police about what happened to Solange. Roch agreed to plead guilty to second-degree murder if no other charges were brought against him. In the end, Roch was sentenced to life in prison, being eligible for parole in 1999. Roch would never see life outside of prison again, though. He would get a taste of his own medicine, being murdered by one of his fellow inmates on February 26th, 2011. There is so much of this story that I had to leave out because of time and trying to keep this all in one episode. The victims of Roch all suffered immeasurably, and all by a man who just wanted power and control over them. Up until his death, Roch still had several of his followers visiting him in prison and showing their loyalty. Gabrielle wrote an account of her time with the Anthill Kids and how it's truly a miracle that she survived. It is in French, though, and I haven't been able to find an English translation. But if I do, I'm definitely going to be reading that. The whereabouts of other members are unknown, but I truly hope that they were able to get the help that they needed and heal after what they went through. It's just so crazy that this all started out so innocently, insane, but innocently, and turned into such a horrific line of events for these people. My heart goes out to these people and their children and their families. Thankfully, all of the children in the cult were made permanent wards of the Crown, meaning they all went into foster care and likely were all adopted. One of the adoptees was actually the man who married Roch to Solange after she passed. he quickly realized that Roch's commune was bad news and actually stood up to him in front of some of his followers and had absolutely no communication with him after that. I will have a link in the description where you can read all of the information and get the entire story. I'm sorry I couldn't all fit it in here, but after 4 hours of trying to condense it, this is where we wound up. And I still think this is going to be entirely too long of an episode, but here we are. But thank you guys so much for listening. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the podcast and please leave a 5-star review because you know that really helps your girl out. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that like button for me. That pushes it out to the algorithm and gets more people to listen. If you are not following us on Facebook, please do so at For the Record with Tess Heard. You can also join our private fan group, the Record Keepers. If you're not following me on Instagram, you can also do that at type.1.tess. And if you have a case suggestion or have any questions or just want to say hi, shoot me an email at fortherecordwithme@gmail.com. Alright guys, I hope that you all have a fantastic weekend, and until next week, the record will so reflect. This is just a little post-editing update. I realized that I never came back to what happened on February 17th, whenever the world was supposed to end. Of course, that day came and went, and the world did not end. There was no boulder-sized hail, there were no earthquakes, there was no lightning. It was just an ordinary day. So, of course, Roch decided that the best way to explain this was to say that interpreting God's time was difficult. What is one time frame in God's eyes is a different time frame in man's eyes. And of course, the followers just believed that with no questions asked. And I couldn't find anything that said that there was a secondary earth-ending, world-ending day. So, I just wanted to throw that little bit in there so you guys wouldn't be like, oh, she never said anything about that. What happened with that? There is that. Okay, continue on to your next podcast.